Thank you for joining the Lakeside Light Podcast. It's light to help you see your way, and a light version of our full televised Sunday services, which you can find on our website at lakesidechurch.org. This audio podcast is a weekly sermon message of intellectual, spiritual, and sometimes humorous nourishment for the road. Enjoy.
Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I mean, it feels like years ago, but it was only a few weeks ago that we started this stewardship campaign and this sermon series related to it. And so it was only a few weeks ago, on October 13th, that we started out by talking about the story of the tabernacle and spending time in the book of Exodus. But since it feels like it was so long ago, I'm going to jog your memory. We're going to zoom out a little bit and remember these foundational stories of our faith, this story of the liberation of the people of Israel. This transition for the people of Israel from living under the rule of Pharaoh into living under the rule of God. At the beginning of Exodus, right, the people live under Pharaoh. And I've always loved and appreciated that there is not a specific Pharaoh named, it is just Pharaoh, right? And we know what Pharaoh means. The world of Pharaoh in Exodus is a world ruled by fear and control. Pharaoh rules from a place of scarcity, where the birth of more Israelite people is a threat. Pharaoh exploits and takes and pushes down. And that is the world the people of Israel have been in. And then they escape the world of Pharaoh and have to learn how to live in this new way and are having to adjust to what it means to live under Yahweh's kind of rule instead of Pharaoh's kind of rule. And where Pharaoh rules from scarcity, God rules from a place of generosity, right? Where living under Pharaoh meant living in a place of holding on to fear, living under God meant learning how to trust. And this is a very major mentality shift, right? I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but Michael Chan, a biblical scholar, likens it to the challenges of recovering from an abusive relationship. When all you have ever known is scarcity and exploitation and cruelty, how do you learn? Can you learn to trust? To trust a relationship that is built on generosity, built on freedom. So we're seeing in the book of Exodus and beyond, the people of Israel walk through this transition, right? We see them walking through it with stories like manna in the desert. They begin to wonder if escaping their first relationship was a good idea in the first place, and they're wondering if they'll ever eat. And then God offers manna, but the people of Israel must continue to learn that trust muscle. They have to exercise that muscle by only taking what they need for one day at a time and trusting that the next day there will be more. And there's enough. And then through this back and forth as they learn, as they continue to complain, as there's this golden calf and they're not sure what they can trust, God realizes that the people need a close and physical presence to remember the promises of God, a home for God in their midst. And that's when Moses is given instructions for the building of this tabernacle, this Winnebago that travels with the people of Israel. Maybe you remember that story, right? We talked about it a few weeks ago. Moses says, what I need from you is these things to build the Winnebago, your skills, your time, your talents, and the people give too much. They just get so excited to be a part of building this tabernacle that they bring all of their things to a point where everyone's like, okay, that'll do. That was enough, thank you. I just love imagining this scenario where the people of Israel have been wandering the desert, are trying to recover from this time of slavery, and finally they get a chance to be needed and to be generous, and they feel freed for the first time to give, and so they do. And then all of that brings us to today's readings, the one from Deuteronomy that Kinsey read to us. At this point, the people have wandered for decades, and they have brought this tabernacle along for a lot of the journey, and that has helped them hold God close. And it's been so long, in fact, that the children of those adults who escaped slavery are now the leaders. It's a new generation's turn. They have children of their own. And a lot of those folks don't even remember their escape from Egypt. All they've ever known was wilderness and being in this new land, but they are now able to imagine the next thing. They have just enough stability that they can encamp outside of Canaan and look over into the land of Canaan and imagine. And the time has come for them to imagine something more permanent and what it will be like to live together in Canaan. Now, in the wilderness, we take things a day at a time, but what will living under God's rule look like when we have settled into our own land, they wonder. So through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we get lots and lots and lots of ideas about how to live under God's rule. And then nestled within them are all of these rules about living in community. How do you live together? And that brings us to this text from Deuteronomy. When you're reaping in the field, when you're gathering all your little pieces of wheat in, and you miss a sheaf, which you inevitably will, just leave it. Just leave it. When you're getting grapes off of the vines or beating olives off of a tree, after you've beaten them all to the ground, don't go back up to the branches to get the last remaining ones. Just leave them. Leave them. And everything that's left behind will help cover the needs of this Old Testament trifecta of vulnerability. We hear about it over and over again. It represents the people on the margins, the widow, the orphan, the alien, the person who is not from here. There's a similar law in Leviticus. Leviticus says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings from the harvest. That's more like the Deuteronomy there. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. These are the gleaning laws. There will always be a corner left over for whoever needs it. There will always be olives and grapes and sheaves of wheat for the taking, waiting for the one who needs it. In Pharaoh's world, you strip everything bare, you squeeze the land, you squeeze the people until they're dry. When you hold the power and the resources, you use them and exploit them and then stow extra away for lean times. In Pharaoh's world, that's what you do. But in God's world, there will be enough, and there will be more than enough. So you leave it. If you live in God's world, you quite literally err on the side of generosity. Now, most of us aren't exactly beating olive trees today, but what do you harvest? What are your resources? What are the ways that you harvest? And of course, inevitably, we have to ask, do you suck those resources dry? Do you beat the bushes for every last thing? How do we treat our resources like we live under the rule of Pharaoh? How do we treat our resources like we live in a world ruled by fear and scarcity and self-promotion? And do we, or how do we treat our resources like we live under the rule of God? course, we don't actually live in the land of Canaan, and it is easy to look out at a future land from afar, to dream about what it could be like and what laws should be in this imaginary future, but it is an entirely different thing to actually live in the world, right? Whether or not you have control over the land or the power, it is a different thing to live in Canaan. Which brings us to today's gospel addendum. A couple of thousand years after the people overlooked and dreamed about what it would be like to live in the land of Canaan, they were there. And Jesus was with them. And it was certainly not controlled by the people of Israel. Once again, they were living in the land of Pharaoh. Jesus' followers are under the thumb of Rome. And so he gets all these questions. What do we make of God's law now, Jesus? What about here and now? Deuteronomy and Leviticus were all good and well for Moses and our ancestors as they dreamed and imagined about when they were in control. But that's not where we are. What do we do when things are tight? What about when, once again, we live in the land of Pharaoh? So in this section that Kinsey just read, this little bit from Matthew, that's part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is answering these questions, and again, he refers to these ancient laws. You have heard it said, but I say. Does that sound familiar, right? You have heard it said, but I say. And at first glance, it may feel like he's countering these ancient laws. You have heard it said, but I say. You're right, everyone. That worked when you were supposed to be in control of the land and live in times of plenty, but I say to you, maybe he's going to counter the laws, but that's not what Jesus is doing here. That's not what Jesus does. As the people of Israel live in a continuing land of Pharaoh, Jesus doubles down. Jesus is doubling down. Instead of adjusting the rules or qualifying the generosity or hedging bets, Jesus doubles down. If anyone wants to take your shirt, give them your coat as well. If anyone wants to go 1 mile, you go 2. If anyone asks to borrow something, don't refuse them. The world may look like it belongs to Pharaoh, but we don't follow the way of Pharaoh. Jesus doubles down. When things feel dangerous or insecure, or each one for themselves, when logic tells us that it might be best to go ahead and pick every last olive just in case, and to go back and ensure we've gotten every last sheaf that should, after all, rightfully be ours for the taking, when caring for the vulnerable and the outsider seems like a naive ideal unfit for the world we actually live in, Jesus says, nah, we double down. Lakeside, you know what it looks like to double down. All logic has told us these past few years should have been lean years. We've had transitions, we've had pandemics. And while it's true that 2024 is not over, and we may have a few things left on the floor to glean when we're done even yet, it is also true that you have already given generously large corners of your resources, of your time, of your money, of your talents. Together, we've updated the floors and continued to invest in this building. And the building might be aging, but it is definitely not ready to quit. And it happily buzzes full of dozens of community groups through each week, including our daily beloved preschool, including these times when we're all together for worship. You've doubled down on supporting a thriving ministry of arts and music and offering spiritual bread for the journey. And it's in a way that not only touches the people who are physically here, but has been reaching people across the globe, quite literally. Your live stream feeds spiritually people across the globe. And did you know that this last year, in 2024, your general budget not special mission givings, just your general budget, what you give to when you pledge, has given away a little over $40,000 to community partners. Over $40,000 to Kentucky Refugee Ministries, to Emergency Shelter, where we bought new beds for their shelter, to the ongoing partnership with Children of Ludlow After School program, to a new breakfast ministry in Covington, where people are fed a hearty, delicious breakfast every day, no barriers, to Loaves and Fishes, which helps create bedding and warmth as it gets colder and colder for people who are living on the streets. And of course, just last week, when our goal was 100, you said, "Now let's double down." You made 150 buckets. And that was just part of a larger effort that you helped organize that led to 175 buckets and cash on top of that to help people dealing with hurricanes and disasters around our nation. And this year, by the way, I also witnessed, as so many of you have given your emotional labor to this community, the very real resource of caring about this community. You have taken those extra hours that are left over on your calendar and you've generously let us glean them by showing up in really hard places with grace and courage and generosity. Giving to a community, giving away can feel like risky business. It takes trust to believe that there is enough and there will be enough. So I'm ending this sermon with words I used at the beginning of this sermon series again. We are surrounded by Pharaoh's world. We are told over and over again that there is not enough, and we are not enough, and we should be afraid. We should protect what we have and control what we can. But this is not Pharaoh's world. This is not Pharaoh's world, it's God's world. And our God promises enough. God is enough. We are enough. That is enough. And one more addendum. Lakeside, in 2025, let's double down. Amen.
The Lakeside Light Podcast is a copyrighted production of Lakeside Presbyterian Church. Visit our website at lakesidechurch.org for more information. Have a great week.